Hi, I'm Becky Mitchell, and joining us today on the Museum Roadshow is Hans Gilsdorf and Lainey Clear, and we are sitting in a bit of an exhibit display from the courthouse, so kind of cool. But today we're not talking about the courthouse and the history of the courthouse. No. We're going to talk a little bit about a peat bog exhibit that Hans has been working on for us at the museum, and kind of the process it's been, and sometimes how it can take, it takes a period of time to kind of develop and get a vision and an idea of where we want to take something. So back in about 2021, we received a call from a gentleman in the Frazee area. He had discovered some bison bones in a peat bog, is the story. And he had already sent them off to the state archaeologist, and they had done some research on them and dated them, but there was a unique quality to those bones. You want to touch on that, Lainey?
The fact that made the bones so unique and had historical value is that they still had cartilage preserved on them, which usually if an animal dies and you find their skeleton later and it's in the middle of a pasture, they lose that softer tissue. All that you have left is just bone. But our bison bones, due to the nature of the bog and the fact that it's an oxygen poor environment because the dirt is laden with water, it deprived the bones of oxygen so that cartilage couldn't break down. So we have a lot of pieces of cartilage of our bison still intact.
So at the advice of that state archaeologist who said, you know, this is what makes these so unique and rare and what a fabulous learning opportunity, we advised him to contact a museum. And so he had contacted us. If you recall, we were not in a position really in 2021 to do much with those bones because we were getting ready to move out of that old facility. And the new facility was in the works, so to speak. And so we, at the museum, did a little bit of research, did a little bit of background, determined that yes, we wanted to do something with them. We did not want to take them and just have them be put away in a box or a drawer and not really utilize them in any way. So I think it was about 2022, I reached out to Mr. Gilsdorf.
Yep. Yeah, no, I remember getting the call, and you had asked me if I wanted to do an interesting project with bison bones, and I was like, sure. You know, I mean, because I used to, back years ago in my career, I started off with working with museums, and so I would do, you know, like museum displays. I would sculpt like the main featured animal, say like a T-Rex or a hadrosaur or a humpback whale or whatever, and we would make the dioramas that you'd see in museums. And so this is kind of right up my alley. It had been a long time since I'd done it, but yeah, I was like, oh, that sounds really intriguing and interesting. And I remember, so then we met at the museum. We had a few other locals that specialize in dig sites or taxidermy with Sunram taxidermy, and then we had Bachmans come out because they're you know, butcher animals, because we had all these bones, and he thought there might have been 3 animals, but then you know, we only have 2 skulls, and but you had to make sure we didn't have like 3 potential skeletons. You know, versus just, you know, we only found 2 skulls out of there, but it turned out to be a mature bull and then a younger bull. But again, all these bones were compiled into this collection that we had to sort out.
Many hours in that old facility, kind of sorting everything out before we moved. And originally my mind kind of immediately went to some sort of exhibit that maybe, knowing very quickly that we didn't have a full skeleton, I had this idea of what if we took half of it and it was the bones standing up, and then half of it, maybe Hans could sculpt the other half of this bison. And that was kind of where my mind immediately went. And we pretty quickly found out that probably wasn't going to be the way we could utilize them for an exhibit.
And then also moving into like a new exhibit, we didn't know exactly how the setup would be. So we wanted to, you know, through our dialogue, and was to come up with a cabinet system that would be able to be mobile. You know, so it can move around, shift where the exhibit might have to, you know, move to, or it might be able to, say, tour to a different museum. But then being restricted to its size and the limitations we had with the actual 2 skeletons, we kind of, through meeting with the Bachmans and meeting with, you know, some others about, it's more intriguing about the peat bog. Actually, was we've all seen skeletons of bison and a skull or whatever, but
Deer, I mean, lots of skeletons,
exactly.
of course.
Yeah, and we've seen taxidermied bison, but the intrigue was more of the peat bog and what's in our backyard. And these were found just north of Frazee, and it turns out we have peat bogs all over the place, and you never really venture into them because they're swamp grounds. You can't really walk into them unless during winter season. But then when you're driving by, it's like, okay, you see the surface, but what's below?
Right. So that led us to really doing a little bit more research on peat bogs. And Lainey, you've both done a lot of that research.
Yeah.
But what do you think is the most fascinating thing about a peat bog?
I love how just dynamic and constantly changing a peat bog is. It depends so much, on the season, but also on the water table of the areas surrounding us. So in our really wet seasons, your peat bog, which is made up of peat, is just decomposing plant matter that doesn't decompose all of the way because there's no oxygen, like I mentioned with how the cartilage is still on those bones. But anyways, that peat will float and water flows underneath it, and all of a sudden you have aquatic species below, you might have bugs and other smaller species within, and your terrestrial animals like a coyote, seen in our exhibit on the top of it. There's always so much going on there that, like you mentioned, when you just drive by it on the road, you don't see it.
Yeah, you never think of it. Yeah. And then in this particular peat bog, the Bachmans, they own part of it. And so they really kind of educated me about this life of this peat bog, and at one point, it was levitating, and he kind of described what kind of fish were in there. So it was a lot of dialogue amongst yourselves, but then reaching out to the public and the community and people who either live near it or know about this type of stuff and asking a lot of questions. It has helped us to kind of come up with this design concept of what is a peat bog. And so one half of the exhibit shows what the peat bog is from life now, life then, life now. And then on the backside is highlighting the specific bones so people can learn more of the anatomy of what these bison are. And but the whole process has been really exciting about meeting so many new people and researching that now I'm inspired to really get out there and wander around more, because it's like, wow, I did not know what a peat bog really is.
Right. And what led the individual to finding these, of course, was that particular year the water table was very low, and so there was a lot more of that bog exposed, and they became exposed. So it's ever changing and ever definitely a whole ecosystem that happens in those little bogs.
Right. And then part of the research of what I've been doing is we found with Snake River Farms down in Becker, Minnesota, they've been finding bison antiquus, which are a different species than what this bison is that was discovered. So we went down and met with them, and he really helped us to kind of, for me, in the design point of how the bison probably would have been discovered with its head up, because obviously they broke through either thin ice or through the water. They'd wander in during the summer thinking it's a pond, but they get stuck in the muck and they go down. So obviously, like any one of us, we'd be going for air as we're drowning. And that's where that had up with the composition design of how the skeleton would be.
I think that's one of my favorite parts of this exhibit, and we'll have some pictures we're going to share, of course, but is that you've really worked hard to make it how it would have been, as opposed to, say, again, reconstructing a skeleton and then maybe 3D printing some of the bones that we were missing and what have you. This is more of what would have been naturally occurring right here in our backyard.
Yeah, and this would have been basically like if you just took a big wedge out of this peat bog, and that's how the bison would have died, which Rob Larson, who's a friend of mine, he's done some paleontology work, had said that the position of what the bones are tells more than actually standing them up, because skeletons don't walk around.
Right, right. And with that, we're going to learn more about your artistic process and more of the research you've both done on this in episode 2 of the Peat Bog Bison Bone Display. Thank you for joining us.